Hi guys, sorry to interrupt your viewing, but please subscribe to the channel and like this video. Thank you.
I always knew I wasn't the favorite, but I don't think it really hit me until I was in my 30s, sitting across from my parents at my younger brother's housewarming party, listening to them gush over how grown up Jake had become. He had just gotten married to a sweet, quiet girl named Megan, and they were now the proud owners of a 3-bedroom house in a nice suburban neighborhood with a fenced yard and a stupid little mailbox that looked like a red barn. My parents had helped them move in, helped them paint the living room walls, even paid for the fridge and the washer-dryer set. And then they gave them the biggest gift of all, a fat check for the down payment. Not a loan, a gift. Just like that. Jake was always the golden boy from the day he was born. I was 5 when he came into our lives, and I still remember the way my mom looked at him like he was something holy. She used to joke that he was her miracle baby, like I'd been some kind of practice run. I was the one who got the hand-me-downs, the one who had to get a part-time job at 16 while Jake was given a brand new car the day he got his license. I brought home A's. They told me not to brag. Jake brought home a C-. They celebrated like he'd cured cancer. When he got caught shoplifting in high school, they called it a phase. When I stayed out late with friends, they called me irresponsible. Still, I told myself it would balance out in the long run. I went to college on scholarships I had to fight for tooth and nail, while Jake got to float through community college and eventually dropped out because it wasn't a good fit. I moved out at 22 and worked 2 jobs just to afford a 1-bedroom apartment in a sketchy neighborhood with mold in the ceiling. Jake stayed home until he was 28, and when he finally moved out, it was straight into a house that my parents helped him buy. At that housewarming party, I was the only one who brought a gift that wasn't bought with someone else's money. I gave them a framed print of a map of the city where they met, a thoughtful, handmade thing I'd found from a local artist. Everyone else just showed up with gift cards or nothing at all. And yet, my mom barely even looked at it before setting it down next to a stack of envelopes, her attention already back on Jake. Later that night, after most of the guests had left, I found myself sitting with my parents on the back porch, the 3 of us sipping wine while Jake and Megan cleaned up inside. It was quiet. Peaceful, even. And then I asked it. I didn't mean to, but it just slipped out. So, I said, "Do you think you'd be able to help me out the same way you helped Jake? With a down payment, I mean." They both looked at me like I had asked for a kidney. My dad gave a little laugh, the kind of laugh people make when they're uncomfortable but also don't care enough to pretend otherwise. "Emily," he said, "you've always been independent. You'll figure it out." My mom nodded, like that settled it. "You've always been the strong one." Strong. That's what they call you when they don't want to help you. When they want to let you drown, they tell you how good you are at swimming. I didn't say anything at first. I just looked down into my wine glass and smiled. That smile you make when someone slaps you, and you pretend it didn't hurt. "You're right," I said after a moment. "I will." And that was the moment. Not the moment I decided to prove them wrong. I'd been doing that my whole life. No, this was different. This was the moment I realized that I would not ask again. Not them, not anyone. I would figure it out, all right. But I wasn't going to forget. And I sure as hell wasn't going to forgive. Because some things break in silence. Some betrayals come not with yelling or slamming doors, but with casual shrugs and backhanded compliments. And when they break you that quietly, you learn to rebuild yourself in the dark. Brick by goddamn brick. When they told me to figure it out, they must have thought I'd come crawling back eventually, tail tucked and pride swallowed, maybe asking for a loan or a bit of mercy or some hand-me-down wisdom that I hadn't already taught myself 100 times over. But the truth is, I didn't crawl, I ran. And I didn't run for help. I ran for blood. There's something about being underestimated your whole life that creates a kind of pressure cooker under your ribs, a steady hum of quiet rage that never fully switches off. Some people burn out from it, some implode, but not me. I built from it. I built quietly, like a storm that doesn't crack thunder until it's already overhead. I picked up a second job within 2 weeks of that housewarming party. I kept my main gig as a marketing manager for a mid-sized tech firm and added a weekend job bartending downtown, then started freelance consulting on the side, building up small brands for startups too broke to hire big agencies. I lived like a ghost, no dinners out, no vacation, no unnecessary purchases. I didn't buy coffee unless it was 50% off, didn't replace my cracked phone screen for 2 whole years, and patched my work heels with duct tape on the inside so no one would notice. I drove a 10-year-old Toyota with a dent in the side and used a plastic bag to cover the window when the motor died in winter. But I saved. God, I saved like a damn hoarder saves junk mail and broken toasters. I learned how to invest, not the flashy kind, but slow, boring, methodical index funds that grew like moss on stone. I studied market trends during lunch breaks, watched real estate YouTube channels at midnight while eating microwaved rice, and subscribed to newsletters that most people would find dry enough to kill a horse. Every dollar had a job. Every decision had a direction. I wasn't just trying to buy a home, I was trying to build a monument. A silent middle finger made out of wood, concrete, and stained glass. And I didn't tell a soul. Jake didn't notice, of course. He was too busy living his best subsidized life. Megan got pregnant barely a year into their marriage, and suddenly my parents had a grandchild to obsess over. I became a background character in their golden little sitcom. I got occasional calls, always surface level. "How's work? You dating anyone yet?" And then the inevitable shift in tone when I said I was still renting. "Well, don't wait too long, sweetie. Home ownership is important. Important enough to bankroll for one kid, but not the other." They still thought I was treading water. I let them. Because the longer they believed I was flailing, the sweeter it would taste when they realized I'd already reached the shore, built a castle, and locked the damn gate. 3.5 years after that porch conversation, I closed on a house so far out of their league that I actually laughed the first time I walked through it. 5 bedrooms. 4 baths. A kitchen with a double oven, quartz countertops, and a pantry big enough to get lost in. Hardwood floors that glowed like honey in the morning sun. A backyard with a pergola and a built-in grill station that looked like something straight out of a magazine. And the best part? It was located just 6 blocks from Jake's house. Not by accident. I picked it on purpose. Not to flaunt. Just to let it be seen. Quietly. Naturally. Like karma on foot. I didn't throw a party. I didn't send photos. I didn't even post about it online. I moved in quietly, furnished it slowly, and went about my life like nothing had changed. The only thing I did, the one indulgence I allowed myself, was to keep the windows open. That house sparkled in sunlight. It was designed to be noticed. And I knew, eventually, they'd see it. It happened on a Sunday afternoon in June. Jake was hosting a barbecue, and I was invited, though I hadn't said for sure if I'd come. I'd planned to stop by for a bit, mostly out of curiosity, not obligation. But before I even got there, I got the text from Jake. "Is this your house?" Followed by a blurry photo taken from the end of my block. My parents must have driven past it on their way over to his place, probably thinking, who the hell owns that place? I waited a moment before responding. "Yeah, just moved in last month." Silence. Then, "Why didn't you say anything?" I typed, paused, and then deleted what I really wanted to say. Instead, I just replied, "You told me I'd figure it out." Because I had. And now the house stood there, like a cathedral to every sleepless night, every missed weekend, every sacrifice I made in the dark. A towering, echoing response to all the years they spent pretending I didn't need anything, because I was strong, because I was independent. I didn't need to gloat. I just had to wait. I didn't have to wait long after Jake's barbecue for the shift to begin, that subtle realignment in the air when people suddenly realize you're not the underdog anymore, not the afterthought or the background noise they can safely ignore. It started with a phone call from my mother 2 days after the barbecue, her voice unusually soft, almost hesitant, like she didn't quite know how to step into this new version of the story where I wasn't the struggling daughter scraping by in the shadows. She opened with small talk, asked if I liked the neighborhood, if the move went smoothly, if I needed any help decorating, like we were old friends who hadn't seen each other in years and were trying to find common ground. I let her talk, let her stretch out the silence, But when she finally circled around to the real question, her voice dipped just a little. "Emily," she said, how did you afford that place?" I paused for a moment, just long enough for her to feel it. "I figured it out," I said simply. That was all I gave her. No breakdown of my investments, no speech about hard work, no monologue about the sacrifices they never saw and the nights I cried myself to sleep wondering why I wasn't enough for them. Just 4 words, plain and clean, tossed back at her like a stone in a pond, letting the ripples speak for themselves. From there, things began to shift in small but unmistakable ways. Suddenly, I was getting invitations to lunch, to family dinners, to holiday plans I hadn't been included in for years. Jake's voice had changed too, though he tried to hide it under a thick layer of smugness that had always been his safety blanket. At Thanksgiving, while we were carving turkey at Jake's house and everyone pretended not to notice the tension running under every slice, he leaned over and said with a forced chuckle, "Wow, Emily, must be nice to finally catch up." I smiled slowly, knife still in hand, and looked him in the eye. "Sure," I said. "Nice to catch up." But we both knew the truth. I hadn't caught up. I had passed him. What nobody in that room understood was that I hadn't done all this for the house. The house was a means, not the end. I did it for the moment, this moment, when everything would start shifting in my favor, and they'd have to rewire their entire family narrative around the reality they'd chosen to ignore for so long. They had told themselves I didn't need help because I was strong, independent, resilient, but the truth was far simpler. I wasn't convenient. Jake was easier to love, easier to support, easier to mold into their version of success. I was complicated, sharp-edged, stubborn, and unwilling to shrink myself just to make them comfortable. So they left me to figure it out. And now that I had, they didn't know what to do with me. My father started asking questions too, casual, curious, but always with that undercurrent of awe he couldn't quite mask. How did I learn about real estate? Did I have a financial advisor? What kind of return was I getting on my investments? I answered sparingly, always polite, but never too much. Let them wonder. Let them stew. Because for the first time in my life, I was holding the power, and I wasn't about to give it away. And yet, beneath all the surface tension and polite smiles, something darker was brewing. I could sense it before anyone said a word, something tight in my mother's voice, something clipped in the way my dad talked about market fluctuations and tight spots. Jake looked more exhausted every time I saw him, and Megan's eyes held a kind of fear she didn't know how to express. It wasn't until Christmas Eve, when we were all gathered at Jake's again, because apparently my mansion was still too uncomfortable a setting for family tradition, that the truth slipped out in a whisper I wasn't supposed to hear. "We're going to have to sell," my father said to my mother in the kitchen, his voice low but not low enough. "What about the condo?" she asked, frantic. "It's gone," he replied. "The market ate it. And the annuity, don't even ask." I stood in the hallway, frozen for just a beat too long, feeling the weight of those words settle over me like dust on glass. Financial ruin. It had finally found them. And it was only a matter of time before they turned to me. Before they came knocking, not with smiles, but with open palms. And I already knew exactly what I'd say. The call came exactly when I expected it would, right at that perfect moment when desperation had set in just enough to strip away whatever pride they had left, but not so much that they were ready to face the consequences of their own choices. My mother's voice was softer than I had ever heard it, thinner somehow, as if years of certainty and comfort had been drained from it in a matter of months. She asked how I was doing first, her tone overly sweet, forced in a way that made my stomach tighten with the anticipation of what was coming next. She had never called just to chat before, never made a habit of checking in unless there was something she needed, and now, after all these years, she was finally ready to need me. I let her talk, let her circle around the truth like a vulture trying to pretend it wasn't eyeing fresh prey, but eventually, she got to the point in the way that people do when they have no other choice. They were losing the house, she said. Their savings had dried up faster than they expected, and the market had turned against them in a way they hadn't predicted. My father had made some risky investments, ones that were supposed to pay off in their retirement years, but instead, They had collapsed under them like a faulty foundation, leaving them scrambling for solid ground where none existed. I waited, letting the silence stretch just long enough for her to feel the weight of what she was asking before she finally said the words I had known were coming since that night I overheard their conversation in Jake's kitchen. "Emily," she said, voice breaking just a little, "we need a place to stay." I felt it then, that slow burn of satisfaction curling in my chest like smoke from a fire that had been smoldering for years, waiting for this exact moment to finally catch and consume everything in its path. I could picture them sitting at the dining room table, staring at bills they couldn't pay, panicking over a future they had never prepared for. And I wondered if they had even hesitated before calling me, or if they had simply assumed I would say yes, because that's what family was supposed to do. "We raised you, honey," she continued when I didn't immediately respond, and I could hear it now, that last-ditch effort to guilt me into forgetting every time they had turned their backs on me, every time they had chosen Jake's comfort over my survival. "We're family." Family. The word felt cheap coming from her mouth, like something borrowed, something she had never valued until she needed it to mean something. I took a slow breath, steadying my voice, letting it sink in, every ounce of resentment, every bit of bitterness, every lesson they had forced me to learn alone. "You're independent," I said, voice calm, steady, unshaken. Silence. "You'll figure it out." It landed exactly the way I wanted it to, cutting through whatever illusion of obligation they had been clinging to, shattering whatever hope they had built up that I would step in and save them. I heard my mother inhale sharply, as if she had been physically struck, and for the first time in my life, I saw my father as something other than the immovable figure he had always been, a man who had believed himself untouchable, now crumbling under the weight of his own arrogance. "Emily," my father finally said, voice tighter than I had ever heard it, as if he still couldn't quite believe what was happening. "This isn't funny." I laughed then, low and sharp, because for once, it actually was. "Neither was telling your daughter to figure it out while handing your son everything he ever wanted on a silver platter," I said, letting the words settle like dust in the silence between us. "Neither was making me fight for every single thing while you carried Jake through life like he was made of glass." I could hear my mother trying to hold back a sob, could hear my father exhale harshly like he was about to explode, but I didn't care. They had made their choices, and now, for the first time in their lives, they were going to have to live with them. Jake, of course, called me next, voice thick with anger, filled with all the same self-righteous entitlement he had been spoon-fed since birth. "There are parents," he spat, as if I needed to be reminded of the fact, as if that simple reality was supposed to be enough to erase years of neglect and favoritism. "How can you just turn your back on them?" I smiled, even though he couldn't see me, because for the first time in my life, I was the one in control. "How did you expect me to afford that house, Jake?" I asked, voice smooth, deliberate. "How did you think I pulled it off?" He faltered then, caught in the trap I had been laying all along, and I could practically hear the gears turning in his head as he finally began to understand. "I figured it out," I said again, the words heavy, final. And then, without another word, I hung up the phone. The stunned silence stretched between us, even through the dead air of the call, even through the space between their expectations and my refusal to meet them. The tables had turned. And I wasn't the one scrambling anymore. The calls didn't stop, though I had expected that they wouldn't, because people like my parents don't just accept consequences when they've spent their whole lives being cushioned from them. It started with my mother, voice cracking under the weight of something she had never quite learned how to carry: humility, desperation. The sharp realization that the daughter she had dismissed for years was now the only person standing between them and the kind of future they had never imagined for themselves. She didn't come at me with anger, didn't try to guilt me outright like I thought she would, but instead, she leaned into something softer, something more fragile, playing a role she had never attempted before. She pleaded. She spoke in whispers, in choked-back tears, in carefully chosen words meant to evoke sympathy, but none of it landed the way she wanted it to, because I had already hardened myself against it long before she ever realized she would need me. "Emily, sweetheart," she said one night, voice barely above a whisper, as if she thought lowering her tone would make it easier for me to stomach. We don't have anywhere else to go. I held the phone to my ear, listening to the silence stretch between us, feeling the weight of her words settle in my chest like something leaden and cold. There was a version of me, a younger, more naive version, who might have crumbled at the sound of her mother's voice breaking like that, who might have looked past every slight, every dismissal, every moment of neglect in the name of family. But I had outgrown that version of myself long ago. I exhaled slowly, measured, letting the moment drag just long enough for her to feel it, and then I spoke with the same quiet certainty I had carried since the day they told me to figure it out. "You should have thought about that," I said, voice steady, unshaken. "Before you decided I wasn't worth the effort." The silence that followed was different this time, heavier, thicker, as if for the first time in her life, my mother was beginning to understand that I was not who she thought I was. That I was no longer the child she could push aside in favor of my brother without consequence. She inhaled sharply, a small, broken sound that might have meant something years ago, before I had learned how to survive without them, before I had learned that the only person I could ever rely on was myself. Then, as expected, came Jake. If my mother's approach was fragile, delicate, an attempt to draw sympathy from something that had never been nurtured in me, Jake's was the opposite. He came at me with anger, with self-righteous entitlement, with the same arrogant certainty that had been fed to him his whole life, the same belief that the world owed him something simply for existing. "You're seriously just going to let them suffer?" He snapped, voice sharp, biting, filled with the kind of outrage that only comes from a lifetime of being coddled. "What kind of person does that, Emily?" I could hear the accusation beneath his words, could feel the weight of everything he wasn't saying, the unspoken expectation that I would bend, that I would cave, that I would slip back into the role they had assigned me before I ever had the chance to choose one for myself. But I didn't flinch, didn't react, didn't let a single ounce of his anger shake me. Instead, I smiled, slow and deliberate, even though he couldn't see it. "I don't know, Jake," I said, voice smooth, unbothered. "What kind of parents do what they did to me?" He faltered then, just for a second, just long enough for me to hear the hesitation in his breath, the momentary break in his confidence, because he knew. He had always known. He had just never cared, not when it had benefited him, not when it had kept him comfortable while I was forced to fight for every scrap I had. "You're heartless," he spat, like the words would cut me down, like they would do anything more than bounce off the walls I had spent years building around myself. "You're just doing this to hurt them." I let the silence stretch between us, let him sit in the weight of his own words, and then I gave him exactly what he deserved. I learned from the best. The phone went dead after that, the silence swallowing up whatever else he might have said, but it didn't matter. There was nothing left to say. They had played their part, and now they would live with the consequences. And yet, as I stood there in my too big house, surrounded by everything I had fought for, I felt something strange settle in my chest, something I hadn't anticipated. I had won. I had done exactly what I set out to do, had proven every single one of them wrong, had taken back every ounce of power they had tried to deny me. And yet, as I watched them walk away, as I closed the door on them forever, I found myself wondering why it didn't feel as satisfying as I had imagined it would. Was I right? Or had I simply become everything I had once hated? I didn't know the answer, and maybe I never would.